Welcome back, viewers. Getting back into this great conversation with John Lane. How are you today, John?
Well, thanks, Louis. Yep. How are you going?
Doing just fine in spite of the madness in the world. So today we're going to... I'm sorry?
Do I detect a little bit of a tan there, Louis?
Yeah, just took a brief break with my wife and grandkids, and it's summertime here in the United States. Temperatures in the 90s, right where I like them.
Easy to forget from here, let me tell you.
Yeah, we're in opposite seasons, you and I.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Always in season, however, are these conversations where we're trying to get our hands around this crisis in the church and to come up with some solution that makes sense, as to what the heck is going on. And so I'm weighing all sides of this conversation. And when we examine the sedevacantist argument on the other side, we often hear, look, we've had bad popes before. And the ones that typically come up first, John the 22nd, Honorius, Liberius, those are easy to dismiss because they're apples and oranges. The circumstances are totally different. The go-to, the one that I think is the one that serious people on the other side will present, is the story of a Pope Marcellinus, who allegedly even went so far as to apostatize and did not lose the papacy. So we're going to get into that story a little bit today. And our source for it is going to be a priest by the name of Father Wolf, who I believe is a Fraternity of St. Peter priest and an excellent preacher. A number of his sermons are available on YouTube. And I think once viewers who don't know the name hear the voice, they'll recognize it. And he's going to walk us through the story of Pope Marcellinus. And you and I are going to dissect it to see if it makes sense. How's that sound?
Sounds like a plan.
Very good. All right, so let's begin with Father Wolf introducing the story to his listeners.
So today, what we're going to do is consider one story from Liber Pontificalis. Then after considering that, ask ourselves about the historical value of the data, and then consider the implications.
Okay, and so he continues by trying to set the stage for what we're about to attempt to accomplish here.
If you turn to April 26th in your missal, you'll see that it's the feast day of St. Cletus. He's the third pope. You also see that St. Cletus shares his feast day with another saint, a saint named Marcellinus. You see, even though Marcellinus committed a public act of apostasy, when he offered a pinch of incense to Caesar, he repented. The Liber Pontificalis tells us, quote, Marcellinus himself was dragged to sacrifice that he might offer incense, and he did it. And after a few days, inspired by penitence, he was beheaded by the same Diocletian and crowned with martyrdom for the faith of Christ. After a few days, inspired by penitence, he was beheaded by the same Diocletian and crowned with martyrdom for the faith of Christ. Be very, very careful about jumping to conclusions about our Holy Father. If the Pope does something crazy, it isn't the first time. Calm down, say another decade of your rosary for him, and never forget that God has regard for his vicar.
So there, in a nutshell, John, is the story of Pope Marcellinus, taken from the Liber Pontificalis. What do you have to say about that?
Well, a lot. You'll be surprised to hear.
Of course.
Oh, wow, Louis, it's amazing, isn't it? So, we have a choice before us. We either believe we believe Roman theology. We can open any Roman, approved book of Roman theology and believe what's in it about the nature of the church, her understanding of her own prerogatives, her own perfections, her own powers, the promises of our Lord Jesus Christ and how they've been verified. You can believe all of that, and then crowning all that, you can believe the doctrine on the Roman pontificate, on the papacy. Or you can take as the most certain fact the claims of the last 5 claimants, and you have to throw out what's in the books. And you have to believe the church never understood her own powers, her own prerogatives, her own perfections, and she never understood, most of all, the Roman pontificate. And so that choice is a real division between traditionalists and the ones who end up as sedevacanists, or at least if they're not sedevacanists, they say, well, look, I believe what's in the books, and I can't explain the current situation, and one day the church will judge, which is pretty much where Archbishop Lefebvre stood, right? Maybe the church will declare they weren't popes. So hold that possibility open, but I'm not going to settle it myself. Well, that was the Archbishop's basic line. But on the other side, you've got these people, and they're the sort of dogmatic anti-sedevacantists, and they take as the only certitude that Francis is Pope, or that Paul VI was Pope, and then everything else is uncertain, and they go looking, they go trawling through history to find examples which they can then use to overturn what's in the books and to show people, this is no big deal, happened before, maybe not as badly and not for as long, but in principle it's no different from what's happened before on several occasions. And the St. Marcellinus story, obviously that's the purpose of it, right? So I described that purpose, Father Wolf's purpose in this sermon, is to relativize the crimes of the last 5 so-called popes by blackening the names of prior popes. And I'm not saying that to be pejorative. I think that's what he's doing, right? He's dragged down the papacy prior to 1958 to try and make the post-58 so-called papacy look more Catholic or more normal or more acceptable or more possible. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Because, look, if this story about Marcellinus is true, if we indeed had a pope who had publicly apostatized and committed this terrible act of idolatry, offering incense to an emperor, and yet, not only did he remain pope, the man has been sainted. If that's true, by comparison, Francis doesn't look so bad. He just looks like a bad pope. And in fact,
that's it.
You may hold out hope that one day he'll be Saint Pope Francis. Why not? If Marcellinus is a saint, why not Francis? So I think that's the argument. So what do you think? Is it a valid argument?
Well, no, there's no validity to it whatsoever, and I think that'll become clear as we step through it. But Father Wolf's got some formidable challenges ahead of him in making this even plausible. The story is not found in any reliable ancient source. And we'll come back to the Liber Pontificalis in a second, but it's not found anywhere in any reliable ancient source. The source that it is found in, well, let's just deal with that now. The Liber Pontificalis is a private work. Its origins are obscure, but it's really just a collection, like a thrown together collection of legends. Up until at least the 5th century anyway. After that, we start to get some more historical reliability for a start, but also you get that the book was continued into the Middle Ages, so you can actually at least with some degree of credibility or certitude say who was the editor and who was writing these stories, right, John, at a later age.
On that note, Father Wolf actually goes into a little bit of detail about the authors of the Liber Pontificalis. I'd like to play that for you to hear his version of its origins.
So the Liber Pontificalis is an ancient book containing short biographies of the popes from St. Peter to Stephen V, who died in 891. Scholars think that the authors of the Liber Pontificalis were clerks that were attached to the papal court.
So how does that resonate with you?
No, that's terrible. That's a terrible statement. That he's taking that from the Catholic Encyclopedia article on the Liber Pontificalis. The same article says what I just said, which is that the thing's got no historical reliability whatsoever. So it's not even plausible. And then when it's talking about the later, so post-5th century, in fact, I think from memory, it's that part that he's repeated there, they were clerks attached to the Roman court. I think that's talking about medieval popes, the writers of the histories of the medieval popes. So the entries, in the 10th, 11th, 12th century. There's no way that anybody thinks that clerks attached to the Roman court wrote the legend of Saint Marcellinus as it appears in the Liber Pontificalis. That's not true, and it's a terribly tendentious juxtaposition at best to say that, which is found in the Catholic Encyclopedia, ripped out of its context like it's talking about the story of Saint Marcellinus. Nothing to do with it.
Okay, and to put it in context on the timeline for viewers, Marcellinus reigned from the year 296 to 304. And so I think what you're saying is that whoever the authors may have been, that when they're writing about a pope who reigned in the earliest part of the 4th century, they're looking back several hundred years, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah. So the difficulties, just to go back to the point about the plausibility, the difficulty in making this plausible is the difficulties are manifold, and they are monumental. Okay, they are mountainous. The first thing is that there's no reliable ancient source that tells the story. The second thing is that if you consult any history of the Catholic Church published in the last several hundred years, you will come across either the absence of the story, it's just not there, or if it's there, it's dismissed as a forgery by Donatists, and the proofs are given. Okay, so you won't find the story of Saint Marcellinus presented as something which has real plausibility by any Catholic scholar for hundreds of years. Okay, and this has been an intense the question of the bad popes has been an intense controversy for about 500 years because, of course, the Protestants did the same thing. They raised these examples to try and prove, the Pope's not infallible. The Pope, the faith of Rome is not the faith of the faith of the Christian Church. Popes are tyrants who just make up the doctrine of the Church, over breakfast, and then people who swallow that are obviously departing from Christ. You'd think they were talking about the current situation.
So, John, I want to just underscore what you just said, because I think it's an important point. I don't want people to miss it. So, you and I are talking about this story of Pope Marcellinus in the context of our conversations and the popes from 58 on forward.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is this isn't the first time that this story has been examined and scrutinized, because it's been used by the Protestants before the council and well before the current crisis. So scholars have picked this story apart for hundreds of years.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then there was another period of intense scrutiny of all these historical cases in the lead up to 1870, for the obvious reason,
right?
That papal infallibility was about to be defined. Okay, so there was that, and then that there was a spice added to that controversy by a German historian who was Dr. Dollinger, okay, who actually left the church rather than accept the dogma of papal infallibility, rather than accept the definition. Dollinger and one or two friends, but it was chiefly him, published under a pseudonym Janus, which is the Roman god with two faces. Okay, so the two-faced, under the pseudonym Janus, they published a series of papers in the lead up to the definition, attempting to discredit papal infallibility with what is known as historical theology. Okay, so the Catholic scholars are applying revealed principles to history, and if something can't fit with the revealed principles, then they scrutinise the historical claim very, very intensely, because the certitude of revealed principles is higher than any human story. Okay, Dollinger, in fact, decades before the council, had developed this spirit, which was this modern critical spirit, where he was using historical fact as the highest and the most certain thing, and then deriving so-called revealed principles, if you like, from those. So something like papal infallibility is, and that's the heart of this whole endeavour. If you could find an historical example where a pope had erred, then you would disprove this this doctrine, right? So therefore, it couldn't have been revealed by our Lord Jesus Christ. The Catholic approach is the opposite. Yeah, the Church knows what our Lord Jesus Christ revealed in all ages. She may not be able to express it with perfect clarity because there are questions that have been raised, and she's not yet conscious of the answers. Okay, that's how the theological exercise works. So what you can't admit is this notion that if you discover these historical examples, you'll be able to change theology. That's just, that's to invert the whole thing. That's just to make theology a human affair. Right? It's not a human affair in its principles anyway. So yeah, there was this intense, and then Cardinal Hergenrother wrote an answer to Janus, okay, and that was entitled Anti-Janus. So anybody who's familiar with the history of the Church at all would have come across this controversy, and they would have come across the fact that, you know, Dollinger wrote this book, Hergenrother answered it, and if you're interested in these things, guess what? You'd read those things, right? You'd read the absolute worst that can be said, and then you'd read the authorized Catholic answer to these claims. Now, this story of Saint Marcellinus is so discredited, Louis, that the Protestants weren't pushing it. And by the 19th century, the Protestants weren't pushing it. The only place you would have found it is in sort of a cheap, raggy, watchtower type rubbish, where a Protestant controversialist really doesn't have any credibility and doesn't expect any.
Right.
But the Protestant scholars in the universities had given it up. It was not a credible story because it was invented by Donatists, and everybody agreed its obvious origin was heretics who hated the papacy and hated the Roman Church and wanted to discredit it. So if you read Janus, the book by Dollinger, he says this story is fiction. So even the worst enemy the Church had in that century, pretty much, was admitting this story is fictional. And we can come back to that because Dollinger actually had a bad motive for wanting to discredit this story. But I'm just letting that stand there. As you see what I'm saying? The difficulty that Father Wolf has in presenting this as a plausible story is that even if you consult scholarly Protestant works from the last 200 years, you're not going to find that this is a plausible story. Okay, it's exploded historical myth. That's what it is. So, okay, so just to give you a feel for where Catholic scholarship landed, you mentioned in your comments, Liberius, Honorius, John the 22nd, the usual cases. So I'll read to you what Cardinal Genet. So Cardinal Genet is writing right on the eve of the Vatican Council, and in the Church of the Word Incarnate, right? His book of ecclesiology, which I'm not fond of the book for reasons that are irrelevant, but I think what he says will give you an idea of just where the Marcellinus story stands in terms of its credibility. He refers to, quote, historical studies which have shown that what was once imputed to certain popes, such as Vigilius, Liberius, Honorius, as private heresy, was in fact nothing more than a lack of zeal and courage in certain difficult moments to proclaim and especially to define precisely what the true doctrine was. Unquote. Marcellinus isn't even mentioned. Genet did not feel the need to mention this case. It's so exploded. Anyway, so I'm labouring that, but there's nothing there.
Right, which kind of causes me, it would be speculation on our part, not worthy of a whole lot of our time, but it's kind of surprising to me that Father Wolf would even go down this road. And I have to say, he's not the only one. I mean, I've heard this story before, not in as much detail as we're receiving from Father Wolf, which I have to say, I appreciate this. I've had friends who are concerned that I'm even exploring the arguments of the Sedevacantists, who have, in good faith, tried to help me to gain some clarity over what's going on with the popes. And I've been told this story of Marcellinus. And just based on my friendship, I've accepted, okay, maybe this happened. not even knowing that the story's coming from this Liber Pontificalis. So I really appreciate Father Wolf going into the details, because it seems like the source book for this story is this portion of the Liber Pontificalis that he's reading to us today. John, at this time, I want to play another clip where he goes into what he considers to be the value of the Liber Pontificalis, which I have a feeling is going to vary from your own. Father Wolf continues here.
The value of the Liber Pontificalis, then, is not so much that it is an accurate history of the early church at Rome, as much as it is a reflection of what the early medieval Roman church believed about its own history.
Okay, so he's telling us it's not necessarily historically accurate as to the details of what happened, but it's at least a reflection of what the church in the Middle Ages thought about itself. What do you think about that?
Okay, so I guess what he's referring to is the fact that people like Bellarmine did not discount the story. So we need to understand what's going on with these Catholic writers who are not discounting the story, and there were plenty of them. I mean, this book was around. It was a standard sort of history of the popes, if you like, a chronicle of the popes. Like the breviary, it was not presented as historically accurate. Their concept of history in that time was not scientific. Stories were valued for their moral value, the moral you could take from the story, not for their historical accuracy. Very different from the modern mentality, where the moral of the story is sort of irrelevant, almost, for a modern mind. You just want to know what happened. What are the facts? You know, you might take morals from them, depending on the individual, but that's not the cultural significance of a history now, right? The cultural significance of a history is it's science. You know, that wasn't the mentality. The Catholic theologian who read the story of Saint Marcellinus in the Liber Pontificalis was looking at it and with I guess really only one question: is this story compatible with Catholic theology? And you can see that in the way they handle it. So for instance, they just point out Marcellinus is not free. He's suffering violence, and he's being forced to do something against his will. It's obviously against his will. This is why the force is being applied. And in a moment of weakness, he caves in. Immediately what you have is a situation in which you do not have any evidence for real loss of faith, and you don't have a case that can counter the dogma of papal infallibility. If it's not a free act, then it's not a fully human act. It's not obviously it's not a definition anyway, but it's nothing like that, right? It's not a free act, so you just discount it. And that's all that Bellarmine and co are interested in doing, because they're wanting to defend Catholic doctrine, and the story isn't problematical from that point of view. Someone like Baronius, of course, who was the father of modern history, the father of scientific history, he was interested in the veracity of these stories, and he did try and get to the bottom of it, but he wasn't successful. He wasn't able to come to what later scholars were able to do with better critical techniques, etc. Because the literary criticism developed it became a science, or at least a very refined art in the end, and it does enable us. It does give us better tools for analysing some of these cases, some of these questions. So, in any case, the idea that the Roman Church believed, as Father Wolf seems to be implying, that the Pope can apostatize publicly, remain Pope, etc., is just not. It's not supported by the story as told. So therefore, it just wasn't considered a problem. That's it, really. And if you can read Bellarmine on it. Ryan Grant's translated it. Father Baker, I think, has done a translation. You can read Bellarmine on it, and it's just not regarded as a problem because the act wasn't a free act.
Right, John. So what you're saying then, even if this story as told is historically accurate, even if we grant that, it's not an example of apostasy because he was dragged during a persecution. And in that event, he offered incense, allegedly. If it really happened, it wasn't a free act. So the argument being applied, the argument's just not there.
No, and to understand the attitude of the church to it, the stories there in quasi-official books like the Liber Pontificalis. It wasn't official at all, but you know what I mean by quasi-official. A bit like Denzinger. It's everyone knows it's being published. And nobody's objecting. So it has a sort of a tacit approval. And so you say, well, that's what the church believes. No, that's not at all how it is. It's just there for the moral of the story, etc. So these men who are dealing with like Bellarmine, their purpose is not to dig into the historical question and work out exactly how accurate it is. Okay, that's just not their purpose. So you can't take anything from that.
Right. So circumstances, it sounds to me like the circumstances in which this story is being read determine to what degree it's being scrutinized and in what light. So Father Wolf is presenting this to us as a potentially historically accurate picture of what actually happened. And it's in that context then that you and I are looking at it now to ask the question, is this a true story?
Yes.
Going back to Bellarmine's time, the question of its historicity was not the question before them at the moment.
No.
So they weren't even examining its historical accuracy.
No.
They were simply weren't looking at it that way. Right.
Well, they were in a certain sense. They'll comment on that in passing, like, well, if the story is ridiculous, it's got no basis at all. It's this is a myth invented by the Protestants or whoever, right? In this case, Bellarmine says no, this appears to be factual. So he does pass that comment and that's just a way of getting it onto the table and saying, so let's examine it theologically.
Right, I understand. But the pressing question before him wasn't, is this accurate or not? That wasn't the question. That wasn't the controversy.
Mm-hmm. That's it, exactly. So, just so we can, what I did is because I knew we were doing this, I went and just grabbed a bunch of Catholic history books, right, and copied the relevant pages. And I'll just share with you a little bit but the first one I've got here is actually a couple of pages from Janus, okay, from Dr. Dolinger. So he says, and he talks about fabrications, which were developed to establish papal principles. Right? So he's an enemy of the papacy, this man, and he's ascribing anything he can to a forgery to try and discredit, any historical support for the recognition of papal prerogatives historically, right? So he says he's full of defamation, this man. He says the emperor was hated in Rome by the Pope, right? So the acts of the Council of Sinuessa and the legend of Pope Marcellinus were invented, and the, quote, Constitution of Sylvester, unquote, that is the decision of the Synod of 284 bishops, pretended to have been held by him in 321 at Rome, evidently compiled while the bloody scenes in which clerics were murdered or executed for their crimes were fresh in men's minds. Then again, the principle was inculcated that no one can judge the first see. What he's saying, what he's referring to there is that it's in the Acts of the Council of Sinuessa, which Father Wolf referred to. Right. Oh, has he referred to? Anyway, in his sermon, he does refer to it.
He does, yes.
Is the first historically, right, just in terms of texts that are handed down to us, the first time you come across this statement, the first see is judged by no one, is in those fraudulent acts.
Is that true, John?
That's true. That's a fact. So Dollinger jumped on this to say that, you guys all agree these acts are fraudulent. Well, that's the first time this statement appears in history, along with the tale of Saint Marcellinus offering incense, etc. So he's sort of trying to catch Catholics on the horn of a dilemma. Like, if you want to save Saint Marcellinus, you have to lose this principle: the first see is judged by no one.
John, let's linger on this point for a second. So,
Yep.
if this is the first time that we find that exact phrase, the first see
Yep.
is judged by no one, fine,
Yep.
early part of the 4th century. There's plenty of evidence in the centuries preceding that all of the other churches defer to the judgment of the first see. So while that
Absolutely.
exact phrase is not used, the idea that the first see is not judged by anyone, the principle is clearly there, even if the phrase was not uttered so specifically, correct?
Which is exactly what everybody replied to Janus, right? It's like, so what?
Right, okay.
Is all this other mountain of evidence for the nature of the papacy, right? It's overwhelming. But anyway, that's what it is. I'm just Moray Thompson. So Moray Thompson is Moray was an historian, a continental historian, but Thompson was an American priest, I think, who translated that work, which was in French, I believe, into English, and it became a standard American 2-volume, I think it is, 2 thick volumes, History of the Church, the sort of thing you'd find in seminary libraries, and maybe it was used as a seminary text. They say, as to Pope Marcellinus, who governed the church after Caius, so from 296 to 304, we would prefer to know him from some source other than the writings of his foes, the Donatists. And away he goes, and he gives no credit to the story. He just says, no, Donatist invention, right? That's Moray Thompson. The next one I've got is I don't have the sorry, Louis. I've not written the name of the book on this one, but this guy's quoting Tillemont, so famous primary sources historian. So you've got your popularizing historians, like your Philip Hughes. People would be familiar with Philip Hughes. He's writing for the public and for maybe as a seminary text, something like that. Then you've got your real, your Baroniuses and your Hergenrothers and these sort of people who go into the archives, find the primary sources, and do the textual criticism, do the hard work, very detailed work on any given question, right? So Tillemont's one of those, okay? Tillemont is that Marcellinus at this time received the crown of martyrdom. That's October 24, 304. He was deposited in the cemetery of St. Priscilla in the Via Salaria near the bridge of Salaro. We have mentioned that the Donatists some years later dared to calumniate the memory of this holy pontiff. They pretend that St. Marcellinus, unable to endure the torture, had denied his faith. This falsehood was ornamented by all the circumstances which could give it the appearance of truth. It purported that the pontiff, acknowledging his fault, had presented himself as a suppliant before a council of 300 bishops assembled at Sinuessa. There he had confessed it and requested with tears that a penance should be imposed upon him proportionate to the guilt he had incurred. The council was said to have replied, quote, "Pronounce your sentence upon yourself. The chief see ought not to be judged except by itself." So that's that famous phrase, right, in a different translation. But in this odious fabrication, all is false. The accusation is now recognised as calumnious, and consequently the innocence of the pontiff is admitted. St. Augustine, speaking of Petilius, the author of this fable, says, quote, "He accuses Marcellinus of being a traditor," So a traditor was someone who handed over the sacred books, because they said that Marcellinus offered the incense and that he handed over the sacred books. I guess the Holy Scriptures, the Missal, So a traditor, a wicked and sacrilegious man. I, St. Augustine, declare him innocent. It is not necessary to weary myself to prove his innocence, for Petilius does not venture to prove his accusation. So that's, I think that is from, it'll come back to me, okay. So here's another one. This is another Lives of the Popes and History of the Church by the Chevalier Arthur de Montor. So this is actually a multi-volume work in French. This one's been translated. He says, the falsehood which was circulated on this head, so about St. Marcellinus, was adorned with all the circumstances which might give it an air of probability. So similar phrasing to the previous one. It was pretended that the pontiff, perceiving his fault, presented himself as a suppliant before a synod of 300 bishops assembled at Sinuessa. There ran the story, the culprit confessed his error, etc., etc. Okay. But in this statement, every particular is false. It is now ascertained that the accusation is calumnious and that the pontiff committed no fault, etc. So that's de Montor. Here's Francis Patrick Kenrick. Kenrick wrote a history of the church, a history of the popes. The primacy of the apostolic see vindicated is the title of the book. He says that the Donatists endeavoured to tarnish the lustre of the Holy See by a groundless report that Marcellinus, whose pontificate closed the 3rd century, had yielded to the persecutors and offered incense to idols. The slander was indignantly rejected by St. Augustine, who saw no need of refuting what was supported by no proof. And he quotes St. Augustine. This one's a seminary history book, so written for the use of seminaries in the USA by Dr. Heinrich Brueck. He was writing in German for a German seminary, and it was translated by Father Pruente for the use in US seminaries. So again, he says, Marcellinus died a martyr in the Diocletian persecution. That he had ever sacrificed to the idols is a lie invented at a later date by the schismatic Donatists. It was immediately denounced as such. That's the reference to Marcellinus.
So, John, we have like a parade of very serious historians who are all dismissing this as a mere fable, an invention. And you mentioned several times it's an invention of the Donatists. Who were the Donatists?
Well, interesting crowd. They were schismatics. They were also heretics. They had this notion that you had to be pure to be in the church. So they were the fundamental heresy of the Donatists was that a sinner was no longer a Christian. They went so far with this, obviously this then caused a schism, and they went so far with this to claim that they were the church and that the Roman church and any other church that was in communion with Rome was actually outside the church by being in schism with the true Christians, the Donatists. St. Augustine answered them at length in multiple books, and they are really worth reading because you get this wonderful spirit of adherence to truth, the spirit of faith from St. Augustine, but also this wonderful charity towards the Donatists. He's always inviting them. He says, you have many good things there that you've taken with you and you shouldn't have. Come over with us where you can have all good.
Right.
it's just wonderful charity. So he's not just, there's none of this ugly modern, divisive sort of attitude to the whole thing. He's always got the good of souls in view. There's the good of the Donatists. So that was the Donatists. They were chiefly in Africa, and therefore St. Augustine, being in Africa too, North Africa, was obviously the man on the spot. And their purpose in inventing this calumny against St. Marcellinus was precisely to say, oh, don't say anything against us. You've got traditors and people who offer incense to idols. So pathetic in the faith that they can't even hold out under a little bit of pressure, like Marcellinus. And St. Augustine just dismisses it. He just says, you don't even bother to try and give us any detail or prove it. I declare him innocent. So it was actually a nothing story. The only thing that probably gave it any currency at all was that it ended up in this legendary collection, the Liber Pontificalis. Otherwise, I think it would have died then, like fully died then. It never would have been raised again, Louis.
Right.
Yeah.
But, Father Wolf is going to come back to St. Augustine a little bit later. I'd like to play a clip where he mentions St. Augustine and his engagement with the Donatists on this story. Okay. The next clip I want to play, though, is Father Wolf kind of summing up the story, and it's the historical part of the story, such as he's presenting it.
During the persecution of Diocletian, Marcellinus himself was hailed to sacrifice that he might offer incense, and he did it. That's a public act of apostasy. The offering of incense before the Roman emperor or before his image is an explicit recognition of his demand to be treated as a god. So if a Christian willingly offered incense to the emperor or to his image, he committed an act of idolatry and apostatized from the faith. There's more historical data. Another manuscript of the Liber Pontificalis contains more information about this episode, and I quote, "And after a few days, a synod was held in the province of Campania in the city of Sinuessa, where with his own lips, he, Pope Marcellinus, professed his penitence in the presence of 180 bishops. He wore a garment of haircloth and ashes upon his head and repented, saying that he had sinned." Close quote. And there's still more historical data. This story is found in yet another document called the Passion of Marcellinus, which was written sometime around the year 500. Quote, "This document tells of the apostasy of Marcellinus and purports to contain some of the proceedings of the Synod of Sinuessa. In the Passion of Marcellinus, Marcellinus admits his apostasy and asks the Synod to pass judgment on him. The Synod, however, refuses to enter into judgment on the Pope, stating that, quote, "the first see is judged by no one," close quote, which means no one can judge the Pope. And that's actually true. Okay, so that's the historical event.
Okay, so Father Wolf concludes that this is an historical event. This is how it happened. A number of things jump out here, John. One of them is a point that you've already made. One of the things that Father Wolf says is, if a Christian willingly offered incense to the emperor and so on and so forth, then it would be this act of apostasy and idolatry. The story itself doesn't speak of a man who willingly did anything. He was dragged into this situation during a persecution. So the story refutes itself from that standpoint. Another thing that stands out, you mentioned Dollinger's mention of this Synod of Sinuessa. He comes up with the date of 321, which is 17 years after Marcellinus died. He died in 304. He mentions the gathering of being 280 bishops. Some of these other historians that you mentioned, they speak of 300 bishops. You have Father Wolf here talking about a synod comprised of 180 bishops. In all of these cases, allegedly, according to the Liber Pontificalis, this happened a few days after the incense was burned. Is it possible, under any scenario, that 180 bishops can be gathered together in the year 304 in a few days? In my mind, the very idea that a synod can be assembled is so absurd that upon reading that, you should dismiss the whole thing as a fable. Am I wrong?
Well, you'd certainly wonder if there was some error in, copyist's error or something, was it 28 bishops, not 280? Or
Exactly.
you know what I mean. You'd immediately say, well, that's not possible. The thing that's ridiculous about it, as you say, remember, this is a serious persecution. This is a very violent persecution. Everyone's either hiding or dead, and all these bishops are traveling freely through the Roman Empire to get to Rome to this, or to Sinuessa, to get to this synod so that they can gather together in council. It's like, it's not an historical event, right? There's no other reference to this so-called synod in history. There's no other source for this. So it didn't occur. No, you're right. It's ridiculous. It just didn't occur.
Well, we also have the idea that after a few days he was martyred. After a few days there was a sin. It's like you have a couple of different things happening after a few days. Which was it?
Yeah.
The whole thing can't be true. It just doesn't.
No.
So appreciate that you dug into these historical texts, where these serious historians attack the story. But even for a simple man who doesn't have access to those sources that you cited, you just look at it on its face and you have to say it sounds a whole lot like a myth.
Yeah, but I think the thing to keep in mind, Louis, is that if you're a Catholic and you hear this story and you decide, I'll go and look this up, right? Then archive.org has loads of old Catholic books. So even if you don't have a library, I'm blessed to have a large library, Catholic library. But you don't even need it today. You can just go on archive.org and consult Catholic histories, and I'm telling you, you won't find anything which supports the story. So how do you arrive at the belief in it? I'm saying you have to have a prejudice that starts you off, and that prejudice has to be that you're looking for evidence that'll make the pre-Vatican II popes look more like the post-Vatican II popes.
Right.
That's it.
So, John, we've talked about this before, and it does seem, and it's not an original thought on my part. I read this somewhere, and I don't remember who the wise person is that made this observation, but it seems like in cases like this, where people are trying to present arguments on either side of this situation, that they argue in the manner of lawyers who have in mind a verdict that they need to arrive at, and then they labor mightily to line up as much evidence as they can in favor of that verdict, as opposed to walking into the situation with eyes open wide, searching for the truth, whatever it may be. And I'm sure there's times when I'm guilty of doing the lawyerly thing, but by the grace of God, I hope to always be able to look at every situation with eyes open wide in search of the truth. And in this case, it looks like if you're doing that, you're hard-pressed to arrive at the idea that this is a true story that we can apply to the present day.
Well, I think that's right, Louis, but I think we all do. So modern psychologists have got a term you'd have heard of, confirmation bias.
Sure.
So you filter out the evidence that doesn't suit your thesis, and you notice all the stuff that does. And I'm sure we're all guilty of that, which is one reason why having a discussion and a debate about these things, and I'd be happy to debate Father Wolf on this, like any time, any place. That's one of the reasons why it's such a healthy thing to do, to have the comment, because we're all so limited, right? We have a little view of things, but I think there's no plausibility whatsoever to the story. That's what comes out of the books. As I say, even the Protestants had given up on it. But you talk about lawyers. Jim Larrabee said to me recently, these people act like, and he wasn't talking about Father Wolf, he just talked about anti-sedevacantist. They act like they think that that if they can show that you can't convict anybody of arson, that will prove that the house hasn't burnt down. That's it, right? The house is burnt down. We see that, and we're going, why? Who done it? Right? How did this happen? These people are going, don't accuse anybody, and I've got lawyerly defenses for all of them.
Right. But we all agree the house is either burnt to the ground or on fire. We can all see that much. This is
That's
the
it,
truth.
yeah.
Now, to Father Wolf's credit, he does attempt to lay out the counter argument against what he presented. And he does that in the next clip that I'd like to play for you.
Okay, all right.
The evidence against the apostasy of Marcellinus boils down to questioning whether this particular synod of Sinewessa ever occurred, since no contemporary records of that synod have been discovered. But just because no contemporary records of the synod have yet been discovered doesn't mean that it never happened. It just means they don't have any contemporary records of it. When my grandpa applied for Social Security, he didn't have any birth or baptismal certificates. But that didn't mean he hadn't been born or that he wasn't baptized. It just meant that he didn't have the paperwork to prove it.
Okay, John, so just because there's no paper trail, no evidence whatsoever that this synod ever happened, doesn't mean it never happened. What do you think about that argument?
It's it's audacious. so because the issue, it's a straw man argument. The issue is not a lack of contemporary records. Like, we don't have the signed notary, signed by a notary records of the proceedings of the synod. That's not the issue. The issue is there's no reference to it in history at all, except in this calumny by Donatists, right? Just to make that clear, we have no contemporary records of the life of our Lord Jesus Christ. None. If we're looking for documents, there's none. Right? They're all written later by eyewitnesses, sure, but they're written later. They're not contemporary.
Right.
There's no, yeah. You see what I'm saying? So even the Acts of the Apostles, it's a later record of say the Council of Jerusalem. There's no contemporary record, but of course there's historical references to our Lord Jesus Christ and to, so either by eyewitnesses or. And the same thing's true of any other historical event. I doubt we've got anything from the Council of Nicaea. But nobody doubts that, the Council of Ephesus. There's no contemporary documents survive from then. We'd have copies of documents. So it's just a straw man argument. The argument isn't there's no contemporary records of the Council of Sinewessa. There's no historical reference to the Council of Sinewessa.
Right. Big difference. And the analogy that he uses, it's kind of a charming thing that he refers to as grandpapa. I like that. However, I'm sure there's plenty of evidence that his grandpapa walked this earth. There's plenty of reference to the life of his grandfather. Totally different from the synod. There's nothing. There's no reference, no mention, no anything. So it's not a real good analogy. Father Wolf continues down this road to address some of the arguments against the synod happening. He picks it up here.
Secondly, even if the Synod of Sinewessa never happened, that doesn't mean that Marcellinus never apostatized. They're not the same events. There are two events here. One concerns him being hauled before the judge and burning a pinch of incense. The other concerns him presenting himself before a synod of bishops and repenting. Okay, so the long and short of it is that the argument that Marcellinus never apostatized is simply conjecture. At best, it has some plausibility, but even at best, it's still only conjecture.
Okay, so once again, we hear Father Wolf plainly admitting that the story is about Marcellinus being hauled in a persecution to offer a pinch of incense. So here he's saying, even if the synod never happened, that doesn't mean that the event of the apostasy never happened. What do we make of that?
Well, I think, a retired policeman once told me that when he was a young policeman, he'd been a policeman for 40-something years, when he was first in the force, he said a very old policeman said to him, if someone ever lies to you, never believe them again. The same source gives us both stories. So if they're capable of telling us that a whole synod was assembled with hundreds of bishops, and we know that's not true, then what do we make of their? It's a question of credibility, what do we make of the rest of their stories? So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say, I think he's reversing the onus of proof subtly there, right? Because to call it conjecture that he didn't sacrifice is not how it stands. If you're claiming he sacrificed, the onus is on you to prove that, and you got nothing. You've got the words of a Donatist.
Exactly. John, it sounds to me like, the innocence before you're innocent until proven guilty sort of thing. Here in the United States, we act like that's an American principle. But the reality is it's really a fundamental moral principle. We don't have the right to accuse people of misdeeds just on a whim. And you have to prove that you're not a miscreant of some sort. The burden of proof is on those making the allegations, of course. That's common sense, isn't it? I mean,
it is, and I think when you've got St. Augustine vehemently, not just denying it, but declaring Marcellinus innocent, right? Then you've got a situation in which now you've got someone who's potentially unjustly accused by enemies who weren't Catholics and who hated the church. And you've got a doctor of the church declaring him innocent. The burden of proof on those accusers goes up.
Of course.
Actually, in that circumstance. Yeah. It's now you've got a very grave situation, where one side's got to be wrong. Well, the burden of proof goes up, not down.
Exactly.
You can't call it conjecture.
Right. In a legal proceeding, the credibility of the witness is absolutely relevant.
Yeah.
So Father Wolf, now he continues in his sermon now to present the other side, evidence as he sees it in favor of the validity of this story.
Now let's ask if there's any positive evidence to the contrary, positive evidence that Marcellinus did apostatize. As a matter of fact, there is. To begin with, the Roman chronograph, it's a kind of early Christian calendar that contained a list of the councils and the reigning popes, and it goes up to 354. It omits any mention of Pope Marcellinus. A similar calendar that had been issued 2 decades before, in 336, also fails to mention him. Taken collectively, it's difficult to see how these omissions were not intentional. The Christian Eusebius, in fact, he became the bishop of Caesarea in 314, so he's a contemporary of Marcellinus, mentions Marcellinus in his history, but he says only cryptically that the persecution also affected him. In what sense was he affected? Furthermore, by the late 4th century, rumors of the Pope's apostasy had spread. The schismatic Donatist bishops of North Africa cited the apostasy of Marcellinus as proof that the mainstream Catholic clergy were corrupt and weak and a bunch of compromisers. I mean, when you read the Donatist arguments, it's just astonishing. In substance, they're the same as the SSPX arguments. The similarities of their behavior in the arguments is just startling. It's almost unbelievable. Anyway, so the schismatic Donatist bishops cite this apostasy as proof that the mainstream Catholic clergy are corrupt and weak and a bunch of compromisers. Now, these rumors of apostasy are circulating by the late 380s, well within human memory of the events, and centuries before the writing of the Liber Pontificalis or the Passion of Marcellinus. A letter written about 400 AD by a Donatist named Petilian, a letter that's attacking the very legitimacy of the Catholic Church, accuses Marcellinus of not only offering up incense, but also of handing over the sacred books. Now, they call that being a traditore. That's where we get the word traitor, handing over the sacred books.
Well, there's a lot there, John. And one of the things that jumped out at me when I first heard this, Father Wolf mentions the Roman chronograph and its failure to mention Marcellinus. He says that this chronograph mentions the previous popes and councils, and yet there's no mention in that chronograph of the Synod of Sinuessa, which Father Wolf doesn't put any emphasis on that fact. But
good pickup, Louis. Exactly, yeah.
So what do you make of?
Of course, it's absent from the.
So what do you make of this?
I think the thing that stands out to me from the fact that and obviously this is true that there are 2 lists of popes that are nearly contemporary. They're shortly after their 4th century that omit the name of Marcellinus, and it's also true to say that this gave some currency to the legend. I think that later scholars did think that added some weight, but the obvious thing that occurs to me is that this supports Catholic theology, which is that a pope who did lose the faith would not be pope. So you could argue that the compilers of those particular calendars believed the story and said, well, he can't have been pope. If he did that, it's incompatible with the papacy. So they leave his name out. I mean, it is odd that they left his name out. But I think that interpretation is equally plausible with anything else that's been claimed, at least.
Well, it sounds like that's what Father Wolf is saying. He's saying, look, this is evidence that they believed that Marcellinus offered the pinch of incense, and therefore they left him out of this chronology of the popes.
Yes, but that's totally against his thesis.
Right, which would seem like he should be sitting in your chair saying, look at this. They left him out because he lost the papacy.
Look, Sedevacanus chroniclers.
Exactly.
Back in the 4th century.
I mean, it is a curious thing that he's not there, but it hardly supports the conclusion that Father Wolf wants us to draw from this thing. Like he said, it makes the opposite.
Way, Louis, if for sure, if you had nothing but that, what would it tell you? And the answer is nothing. You just wouldn't take anything from it. The absence of the name in the list, you'd go, oh, well, copyist's error, Someone left him out and then the other guy copied.
Right, you'd find it a curious thing, right?
Yeah, but
nothing more.
It's only because of the Donatist calumny that it takes on this sinister sort of tone. You know what I mean? Because that wouldn't be the only example of that. The people would be scandalised by how uncertain some of the list of historical popes is.
Right. John, the other thing that stands out here, Father Wolf makes no bones about the fact that he's hanging his hat entirely on the testimony of the Donatists. And then he goes so far as to say that the arguments of the Donatists sounds a whole lot to him like the arguments of the SSPX, which he clearly opposes. So he's pointing to this source that obviously he has deep issues with and saying that that's the most credible place that I can go to for this story. I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about this. What do you have to say about Father Wolf equating the Donatists with the Society of St. Pius X? Where is the common thread between the two?
I don't know, because Sedevacanus have been accused of being Donatists, including by some SSPX people. I don't know that any SSPX priest, maybe, has ever said it, but that's a complete misconception of what we're saying. Obviously, we're not saying these men haven't been popes because they're sinners and you can't be a sinner and be in the church. This is ridiculous, right? We're talking about the profession of faith. But I hadn't actually heard. Anyway, maybe that's a commonplace amongst fraternity of St. Peter types. They certainly calumniate the Archbishop in those circles, and I know this from personal, contact with people in the fraternity of St. Peter's circles. I don't know if you've heard any of that. I mean, you've been around a long time, and but I've heard that the Archbishop was ambitious, and he was offended that he was overlooked for a decent, prestigious bishopric in France when he was placed in the little tiny corner called Toul after he came back from Africa. And then he was sort of, the implication was he was sort of looking for an opportunity to get even with Rome after the council. That sort of horrible, unworthy comment that sort of does the circles. So calling them, maybe they do call them Donatists, but I hadn't heard it before, and it's singularly inappropriate. That's for sure. What's so ironic is that the purpose of the Donatists was to discredit the Holy See by discrediting one of the occupants, so in this case Saint Marcellinus, and that's exactly what Father Wolf's doing. He's trying to reduce the perfections of the Holy See, the fact that it's the source of unfailing faith. That the faith has never been sullied in Rome. by this comparison. That's what he's doing. Well, that's what the Donatists were doing. Surely. I mean, I'd love to hear his answer to that.
Right. And I've tried to wrap my head around in what way is the society Donatist in their arguments. Are they accusing, well, the Holy Father is a sinner, therefore he's not part of the church? I've never heard that argument from the society. I have some criticisms of them here and there, but I've never heard that one. It just strikes me as a pretty gratuitous swipe at the society that really came out of left field, and I'm not really sure what he was thinking. Maybe Father Wolf one day, John, will take you up on your kind offer to, engage him one-on-one, and we'll have him here as a guest. That would be interesting, and he could explain himself, perhaps.
If he's interested in debating, Louis, let me say right now, I'd much rather debate something where he's got something better to defend than the legend of St. Marcellinus. I'd rather have a better arm wrestle than debate that.
Gotcha.
Okay.
All right, so now I'm going to get to the clip where Father Wolf does come to St. Augustine, and he leverages this St. Augustine and his back and forth with the Donatists in a different way.
St. Augustine himself responds to these claims. He states, in regards to Petilian, and I quote, "You mention the bishops whom you accuse of having delivered up the sacred books. We on our part answer, either you fail in your proof, and so it concerns no one at all, or you succeed, and then it still has no concern with us. For they have borne their own burden, whether it be good or bad, and we indeed believe that it was good. But of whatever character it was, yet it was their own, just as your bad men have borne their own burden, and neither you theirs, nor they yours." Close quote, St. Augustine. In other words, St. Augustine does not absolutely deny the truth of the charge. He just says that Petilian hasn't offered any proof for his accusation, and beyond that, St. Augustine says that even if the charges were true, even if Pope Marcellinus did apostatize, it still has no concern with us. In other words, whether or not this particular pope offered incense under duress is neither here nor there, as far as the legitimacy of the church is concerned. Whatever burden Marcellinus may have succumbed to in his day is of no concern to the Donatist arguments against the holiness of the Catholic Church. The deeds of bad men do not negate the witness of good men. In other words, St. Augustine is familiar with the charges against Marcellinus and personally believes them to be false, but he's not absolutely certain, so he qualifies his answer. So given that Marcellinus' name was left out of two practically contemporary lists of popes, given that St. Augustine's defense of him is very qualified, it seems very plausible to say this pope was involved in something unsavory during the Great Persecution. The only explanation ever given as to what this unsavory activity was is that it was apostasy, as noted in Liber Pontificalis, the Passion of Marcellinus, the letter of Petilian, and the response of St. Augustine. So we can't say that his apostasy is certain, but on the one hand, we can say the argument that Marcellinus never apostatized is at best simply a conjecture, and on the other hand, we can say there are probable grounds for assuming there's a core of truth in the story of the apostasy of Pope Marcellinus.
Well, once again, a lot there. I mean, Father Wolf offers a whole lot of, in other words, there to try to frame what St. Augustine is saying, but I think the most reasonable, in other words, is to say that St. Augustine said it's irrelevant. Whether or not it's just irrelevant. It doesn't apply to your argument. He doesn't offer any defense, qualified or otherwise, of the value of the story. He just says it's irrelevant. He dismisses the argument. What's your take on it, John?
Well, I mean, that's true about that text. It's a good example of St. Augustine's manner of arguing, by the way. It's very beautiful. He's a master of rhetoric, he's a master of logic, and he's just pointing out that, well, this doesn't get you anywhere. Fair enough. But that's that text. If Father Wolf had opened any Catholic author on this, he'd have found the other text in which St. Augustine says, you offer no proof, right? Therefore, I won't bother refuting it, but I declare him innocent. And the way the historians discuss this, they say St. Augustine vehemently rejected the claim of Petilius, right, at the time. So the claims made, the contemporary on the spot vehemently rejects it and says, I declare him innocent. So Father Wolf, I don't know why, but I suspect that he's only read the Catholic Encyclopedia article on it and hasn't actually opened any Catholic books, because if he had, he'd have found the other text of St. Augustine. So there was clearly two texts, right? The one in which he just says, no, that's rubbish. And the other one where he's saying, look, it's, as you put it very nicely, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant to your story, to your case anyway. It doesn't get you where you want to go, which is you're trying to prove that the Roman Church isn't the true church. You're trying to prove that the Roman Church is not indefectible in faith, and that you have the true faith, and you're the elect. You're the remnant church over there in the corner. Maybe that's what he means when he says that the SSPX arguments sound Donatist. Simply that he takes the SSPX as claiming an exclusive sort of, where the remnant well, all I can say, if that's what he means, then all I can say is it's factually incorrect. I mean, Bishop Sanborn and to a lesser extent Father Cicada are maintaining a position, a sort of a sectarian position where you basically, I mean, they're winning with the sacraments if you go to the SSPX, even if you're a Sedevacanist. So they're making a little church over there and saying nobody else is good enough or has the right ideas, and that's not the SSPX position. In fact, the Archbishop's on record many times saying quite the opposite. We are not the church. We don't claim to be the church. We don't claim to be the only Catholics. We're just doing our duty, which is to hold fast to what we've received, and other people are doing what they will, right? So, and we're not accusing anybody. We're just doing what we have to do. That was always the Archbishop. Very modest, absolutely undonatist. That's all I'll say about that.
Right. So, John, I guess in charity, we should assume that Father Wolf is not aware of the fact that St. Augustine vehemently denied the allegations against Marcellinus, because the contrary side of that coin would be that he's well aware of that fact and just chose to withhold it in order to make his point, which would...
I honestly don't. I honestly do not believe that he's aware of it. No.
Right. I would think not.
Honestly, you can tell from the way he discusses the whole thing that he has no idea what he's talking about.
Right, which some people might take that as an insult, but actually in this case it's not. It's the most charitable way to view the situation, that he just does not know.
The only charitable way.
Sure.
He can't know.
Right.
He can't know.
And by the way,
otherwise he's a idolater, right?
Right, exactly.
He's Janus too, which is not. It's not what he is. He's just a man who's got he's a bit impassioned. He thinks that he has to defend Francis, to defend the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith, and it's not true. That's what he thinks, and then everything just follows from that, right? And there's confirmation bias, the filtering process. He dare not read the pre-Vatican II books and just believe what's in them, because it's going to be impossible to do so, right?
Right.
He won't be the same man if he does.
Well, and I have to say, I'm glad Father Wolf approached this, because I've heard a number of his sermons. There's so many of them available on YouTube, and they're good. He's a wonderful preacher,
Yeah.
But he's kind of gone down an irrational, unsustainable path with this particular argument. I think it's the confirmation bias thing that leads there. So, John, we've gone even a little bit over our hour, but it's been a fascinating discussion that I think my hope is that the takeaway for our viewers is the importance of prayerfully entering into this exploration of the current crisis, so that we do walk in with eyes open wide, willing to embrace whatever truth we encounter, and not just those truths that seem to underscore the position that we really want to take,
Yeah, Louis, and just one more thing while I remember, those who attack Marcellinus point out that Eusebius, the church historian Eusebius, has this sort of ambiguous sounding phrase about him that, the persecution also affected him.
Right. Well, that could mean a lot of different things, couldn't it?
Sorry?
That could mean an awful lot of different things.
Yeah, well, the thing to know is that Theodoret, another famous historian, says that he distinguished himself in standing up for the faith under persecution.
Well, John, we all agree,
So,
Father Wolf included, that he was martyred. So obviously
yeah,
the
sure. But what
persecution
I'm saying,
affected him. He was killed for it.
yes, but I'm saying that we don't just have an ancient historian saying that he was affected by the persecution and then leaving it at that. We also have Theodoret saying he was distinguished by his faithfulness under this very persecution, right?
Right, the exact
And no
opposite.
mention of any fall.
Right,
He
right.
distinguished himself, which is what they're pointing out is missing from Eusebius. Eusebius doesn't say he distinguished himself. Well, actually, Theodoret does. So why are you not giving us that?
Right, exactly.
It's very bad. Look, Louis, let's I'll tell you if you want to find lots of this anti-Roman stuff, which these people keep digging up, disinterring these dead bodies. These are corpses that have been buried and excommunicated at the same time. Bell, book, and candle, and have long rotted, and you'd hardly find the dust of the bones, and yet they managed to disinter them in this. If you're not reading Janus, which is one place to find them, I think this is quite good. I came across this looking for Catholic histories. Can you read that? Is that actually legible?
I can see the word popery.
Okay, so this is a preservative against popery. This is what Father Wolf needs. Okay, in several select discourses upon the principal heads of controversy between Protestants and Papists, written and published by the most eminent divines of the Church of England, chiefly in the reign of King James II, and in Volume 3, guess what you find? The legend of Pope Marcellinus,
of course,
in all its glory, and a refutation or a purported refutation of Bellarmine defending Marcellinus and defending the church. Anyway, that's what we're back to, right? We're back to this sort of cheap controversy where anyway, these people aren't serious. I'm not saying Father Wolf's not a serious man in general. I'm just saying he's not approached this question seriously, and he knows it. And it would be good if his viewers knew it too. He has not addressed this seriously.
Right, and I think it's fair to challenge anyone who puts any credibility in the Marcellinus story as if it reflects in some way, manner, or form on what's going on today, to just really roll up your sleeves, dig into the story, and they're going to find what we have concluded, that it's pure fable invented by enemies of the church.
That's it. Yeah.
John, thanks so much for a great program. Looking forward to connecting next time.
Okay, Louis. Thank you.